Case 1. Tony Alamo. Bernie Lazar Hoffman seemed like an ordinary Jewish kid from Joplin, Missouri, until he reinvented himself as Tony Alamo, a self-proclaimed prophet of God who would build one of America's most twisted religious empires. By the 1980s, Alamo commanded absolute devotion from hundreds of followers who believed he possessed divine authority to speak directly for the Almighty. From his sprawling compound in Arkansas, Alamo ruled with iron-fisted control that extended into every aspect of his disciples' lives. Followers surrendered their possessions, their children, and their free will to a man they genuinely believed was God's chosen messenger for the end times. Alamo's charismatic sermons and claimed miraculous powers convinced desperate souls that salvation could only come through complete submission to his authority. But behind the religious facade, Alamo was orchestrating unspeakable horrors. He systematically trafficked children across state lines, forcing young girls into marriages with adult men and subjecting them to ritualistic abuse disguised as spiritual discipline. His compound became a prison where dissent was crushed and innocence was systematically destroyed. The most shocking discovery came when authorities finally breached Alamo's inner sanctum. For months after his wife Susan's death in 1982, Alamo had kept her embalmed body in a glass-topped coffin inside a heart-shaped mausoleum on the compound grounds. He told followers that God would resurrect her and that her preserved corpse was evidence of his prophetic power. The grotesque shrine became a pilgrimage site where disciples would pray over the decomposing remains of their dead mother. In 2009, federal agents raided the compound and arrested Alamo on charges that would finally expose the full extent of his crimes. The man who claimed divine authority was convicted on 10 counts of child sex trafficking and sentenced to 175 years in federal prison. His religious empire crumbled overnight, leaving behind traumatized survivors and a legacy of unimaginable abuse perpetrated in God's name. Alamo died behind bars in 2017, taking his delusions of godhood to the grave, while his victims continue seeking healing from the spiritual terrorism he inflicted for decades. Welcome to Savage Case Files, where we expose the darkest betrayals by those who claim divine authority over innocent lives. If you're passionate about true crime documentaries that reveal shocking corruption behind religious facades, make sure to subscribe to our channel right now. Case 2. A. Allen. Asa Alonzo Allen commanded the largest tent revival empire in 1950s America, drawing desperate crowds of up to 20,000 people who believed they were witnessing genuine divine miracles. His theatrical healing services became legendary across the rural South, where believers traveled hundreds of miles seeking supernatural cures for everything from cancer to blindness. Allen's ministry generated millions of dollars through his Miracle magazine publications and carefully orchestrated healing crusades that promised immediate divine intervention. Followers watched in awe as crippled individuals supposedly threw away their crutches, blind people claimed restored sight, and terminal patients declared themselves healed through Allen's powerful prayers and anointed touch. The charismatic preacher cultivated an image of prophetic authority, claiming direct communication with God and special anointing that enabled him to channel miraculous healing power. His passionate sermons and dramatic stage presence convinced thousands that they were witnessing biblical-level supernatural events in modern times. But Allen's entire ministry was an elaborately constructed fraud designed to exploit vulnerable people's desperate hope for divine intervention. Behind the scenes, he employed actors to pose as disabled individuals who would dramatically recover during his services. Crutches and wheelchairs were strategically planted with healthy Confederates who would simulate miraculous healings for maximum emotional impact on genuine attendees. The financial schemes were equally calculated. Allen's organization collected millions in donations from believers who thought their contributions were funding legitimate ministry work, when the money was actually financing Allen's lavish lifestyle and funding the elaborate deception that kept his healing shows profitable. After Allen's death in 1970, investigators uncovered the systematic fraud that had sustained his ministry for decades. Former employees revealed the careful staging of healings, the use of paid actors, and the deliberate manipulation of vulnerable people seeking genuine help. His healing empire had been nothing more than an elaborate confidence game that exploited faith for profit while leaving genuinely sick people without the healing they desperately sought. Case 3. Lester Roloff. Lester Roloff positioned himself as America's champion for troubled youth, broadcasting his fundamentalist Baptist message across radio stations nationwide while operating a network of unlicensed residential facilities that promised to transform wayward teenagers through faith-based discipline. His followers viewed him as a courageous warrior, standing against government interference in religious freedom. Roloff's Rebecca homes for girls and Anchor homes for boys attracted desperate parents who believed their children needed strict Christian intervention. The charismatic preacher convinced families that secular psychology and government programs were satanic influences, while his faith-based approach would deliver genuine spiritual transformation through biblical principles and unwavering discipline. The Texas preacher's radio ministry reached millions of listeners who heard his passionate denunciations of modern permissiveness and his calls for returning to old-fashioned Christian values. Roloff presented himself as divinely appointed to rescue America's youth from moral decay, and his followers believed his methods represented God's will for wayward children. But behind the religious rhetoric, Roloff's youth facilities operated as brutal detention centers where systematic physical and emotional abuse was disguised as Christian discipline. Former residents reported savage beatings with wooden paddles, prolonged solitary confinement, starvation diets, and psychological torture designed to break their will and force absolute submission. Texas authorities launched multiple investigations into Roloff's homes after receiving disturbing reports from former residents and concerned family members. State inspectors discovered unsafe living conditions, unlicensed operations, and evidence of systematic child abuse that violated basic human rights standards. Roloff's legal battles with Texas regulators became a rallying cry for his supporters, who viewed government intervention as persecution of religious freedom. But court proceedings revealed the horrific reality inside his facilities, where vulnerable teenagers suffered traumatic abuse under the guise of Christian rehabilitation. The preacher died in a 1982 plane crash while fleeing further legal scrutiny, but his legacy of systematic child abuse disguised as religious ministry left lasting trauma for hundreds of young victims who trusted him for help. Case 4. Marjoe Gortner. Marjoe Gortner became America's most famous child evangelist at age 4, performing wedding ceremonies and delivering fiery sermons that convinced audiences they were witnessing a genuine miracle child anointed by God. His extraordinary preaching abilities and charismatic stage presence made him a national sensation who drew massive crowds throughout the 1950s and 1960s. By his 20s, Gortner had evolved into a powerful, traveling Pentecostal preacher whose revival meetings generated enormous revenue through his passionate sermons and apparent supernatural gifts. Followers believed his early calling proved divine favor, and his mature ministry seemed to validate their faith in his prophetic abilities. The handsome young preacher commanded devoted audiences who hung on his every word, convinced they were receiving authentic spiritual guidance from someone uniquely chosen by God. His theatrical preaching style and emotional appeals created intense religious experiences that left lasting impressions on thousands of believers across the country. But in 1972, Gortner shocked the religious world by voluntarily exposing his entire ministry as an elaborate, calculated fraud designed purely to generate income. He collaborated with documentary filmmakers to create Marjoe, an Oscar-winning film that revealed the cynical manipulation behind Pentecostal revival culture. The documentary captured Gortner demonstrating exactly how he manipulated audiences through psychological techniques, fake speaking in tongues, and carefully orchestrated emotional manipulation. He showed how revival preachers used planted Confederates, studied crowd psychology, and exploited people's desperate spiritual needs for financial gain. Gortner's confession revealed that his childhood ministry had been orchestrated by his parents, who trained him to perform religious theater rather than genuine spiritual leadership. His adult career continued the deception as a calculated money-making enterprise that cynically exploited believers' sincere faith. The voluntary exposure sent shockwaves through evangelical Christianity, forcing uncomfortable questions about authenticity in revival culture. Gortner's willingness to destroy his own lucrative career to reveal the truth demonstrated the depth of fraud within the Pentecostal healing movement. Case 5. Lonnie Frisbee. Lonnie Frisbee embodied the countercultural Jesus movement of the late 1960s, transforming from a hippie artist into one of America's most influential evangelists, whose ministry sparked explosive growth in both Calvary Chapel and Vineyard Church movements. His long hair, barefoot preaching style, and claims of supernatural encounters attracted thousands of young converts seeking authentic spiritual experiences. Frisbee's ministry was marked by dramatic mass conversions and reports of miraculous signs and wonders that convinced followers they were witnessing genuine apostolic power. His passionate outdoor preaching drew crowds of hippies, surfers, and counterculture youth, who found traditional Christianity irrelevant but responded powerfully to Frisbee's authentic spiritual charisma. Church leaders like Chuck Smith of Calvary Chapel and John Wimber of the Vineyard initially embraced Frisbee as a modern-day apostle whose supernatural ministry validated their movements. His influence helped establish some of the most successful evangelical denominations of the late 20th century, with thousands of churches tracing their origins to his evangelistic impact. But Frisbee's struggle with homosexuality created an impossible tension with the conservative theology of the movements he had helped birth. As his sexual orientation became known to leadership, he was systematically marginalized and eventually written out of official church histories, despite his foundational role in their success. The tragic irony deepened when Frisbee contracted AIDS in the 1980s. A diagnosis that further alienated him from the religious communities he had created. Church leaders who had once celebrated his ministry now distanced themselves from his legacy, treating his illness as divine judgment, rather than acknowledging their debt to his evangelistic gifts. Frisbee died in 1993, largely forgotten by the movements he had launched and rejected by leaders who benefited from his ministry while condemning his personal struggles. His posthumous vindication came through historical documentation that revealed how extensively his contributions had been erased to protect denominational reputations. The scandal exposed the hypocrisy of religious movements that built their success on Frisbee's charismatic ministry while systematically destroying his legacy when his humanity proved inconvenient to their theological positions. Case 6. Earl Paulk. Earl Paulk built the Cathedral of the Holy Spirit in Atlanta into one of America's most influential megachurches, pioneering the controversial Kingdom Now theology that promised believers they could establish God's kingdom on earth through faith and prosperity. His episcopal title and patriarchal authority commanded absolute respect from thousands of followers, who viewed him as a spiritual father appointed by divine mandate. Paulk's massive church and television ministry reached millions of viewers who believed his teachings represented cutting-edge Christian revelation. His imposing presence and authoritative preaching style convinced followers that he possessed special insight into God's will, making his guidance essential for their spiritual development and eternal salvation. The self-appointed bishop created a hierarchical church structure that positioned him as the ultimate spiritual authority over every aspect of his congregation's lives. Members surrendered their decision-making autonomy to Paulk's prophetic guidance, believing that submission to his leadership was equivalent to obedience to God himself. But behind the religious facade, Paulk was systematically exploiting his spiritual authority to manipulate women into sexual relationships disguised as spiritual counseling. His position as bishop created opportunities for private meetings, where he convinced vulnerable women that intimate contact with him represented divine blessing and spiritual advancement. The shocking truth emerged when DNA testing proved that Paulk had fathered a child with his own brother's wife, revealing a pattern of sexual manipulation that had operated for decades within his church hierarchy. The genetic evidence shattered his carefully constructed image as a moral patriarch and exposed the hypocrisy underlying his authoritative ministry. Multiple women, including his own niece, came forward with allegations of sexual abuse spanning decades, describing how Paulk used theological manipulation to justify his predatory behavior. His spiritual counseling sessions had been elaborate schemes to exploit women's trust and vulnerability for his sexual gratification. The revelations destroyed Paulk's ministry and exposed how easily religious authority could be weaponized to facilitate systematic abuse. His cathedral empire collapsed as the full extent of his sexual manipulation became public knowledge. Case 7. Paul Cain. Paul Cain emerged as the most celebrated prophet in the influential Kansas City Prophets movement of the 1990s, commanding extraordinary reverence from charismatic Christians who believed his supernatural revelations represented direct communication from God. His prophetic accuracy and seemingly impossible knowledge of strangers' personal details convinced thousands that they were witnessing genuine biblical-level prophecy in modern times. Cain's ministry attracted international attention when he joined the Vineyard movement under John Wimber's endorsement, bringing credibility to the controversial practice of contemporary prophecy. His dignified demeanor and remarkable predictive abilities silenced skeptics who questioned whether prophetic gifts still operated in the modern church. The elderly prophet's reputation for supernatural insight made him one of the most sought-after speakers in charismatic Christianity. Church leaders competed for opportunities to host Cain's ministry, believing his presence would validate their spiritual authenticity and attract divine blessing to their congregations. Cain's prophetic pronouncements carried tremendous weight among believers who hung on his every word as divinely inspired revelation. His ability to reveal specific details about people's lives, future events, and hidden circumstances created an atmosphere of awe that convinced followers they were experiencing authentic supernatural encounters. But the prophetic giant's ministry collapsed in devastating fashion when he publicly confessed to decades of hidden alcoholism and homosexual behavior that directly contradicted his public image and theological positions. The admission revealed that his entire ministry had been sustained while living a carefully concealed double life. Cain's confession sent shockwaves through the prophetic movement, forcing uncomfortable questions about discernment and spiritual authority. The man who claimed to receive direct revelations from God had been simultaneously engaged in behaviors that his own theological framework condemned as sinful. The scandal destroyed Cain's credibility and cast doubt on the entire Kansas City Prophets movement, leaving followers questioning whether any of his prophetic ministry had been authentic. His fall demonstrated how even seemingly genuine spiritual gifts could coexist with profound personal deception and moral compromise. Case 8. Peter Popoff. Peter Popoff commanded massive television audiences in the 1980s through his extraordinary faith-healing ministry, where he demonstrated seemingly impossible supernatural knowledge about strangers in his crusade audiences. His ability to call out specific names, medical conditions, and personal details convinced millions of viewers they were witnessing genuine divine revelation through a modern-day prophet. Popoff's healing services became legendary for their dramatic supernatural manifestations. He would walk through crowds of desperate people, precisely identifying individuals by name while revealing intimate details about their illnesses, family situations, and spiritual needs that appeared impossible for him to know through natural means. The charismatic preacher's television broadcasts drew enormous audiences who watched in amazement as he called out specific ailments, addressed people by their exact names, and provided detailed information about their personal circumstances without any apparent prior contact. His confident declarations that "God is showing me" preceded revelations that left audiences stunned by their accuracy. Donations poured into Popoff's ministry from believers convinced they were supporting a genuine prophet whose supernatural gifts validated the reality of divine healing. His organization generated millions of dollars from people who trusted that his miraculous knowledge proved God's direct involvement in his ministry. But skeptical investigator James Randi exposed Popoff's entire operation as an elaborate technological fraud. Using radio frequency scanners, Randi discovered that Popoff was receiving detailed information through a hidden wireless earpiece connected to his wife Elizabeth, who gathered personal data from prayer cards filled out by audience members before services. The devastating revelation showed Popoff's wife systematically feeding him names, addresses, medical conditions, and personal details through radio transmission while he performed his supposedly supernatural demonstrations. His divine revelations were actually carefully orchestrated deceptions, using basic wireless technology to create the illusion of prophetic insight. Randi's exposure on The Tonight Show destroyed Popoff's credibility and revealed the cynical manipulation behind his healing ministry. The man who claimed divine authority had been nothing more than a skilled performer using hidden technology to exploit vulnerable people's desperate faith. Case 9. Henry Lyons. Henry Lyons rose to the pinnacle of African American religious leadership as president of the National Baptist Convention, USA, commanding the respect and trust of 8 million members who viewed him as their spiritual shepherd and moral voice. His eloquent preaching and charismatic leadership made him one of the most influential religious figures in America during the 1990s. As head of the nation's largest African American denomination, Lyons wielded enormous influence over churches, pastors, and congregations across the country. His position granted him access to massive financial resources and corporate partnerships that were supposed to benefit struggling congregations and advance the cause of social justice within Black communities. Lyons cultivated relationships with major corporations and government agencies, positioning himself as the authoritative representative of African American Christianity. His denominational leadership role gave him credibility to negotiate lucrative contracts and partnerships that promised to channel millions of dollars toward worthy religious and social causes. But federal investigators discovered that Lyons had systematically transformed his religious authority into a criminal enterprise designed to enrich himself and his associates. Rather than advancing the interests of his denomination, he was operating elaborate schemes to siphon money from corporate partnerships into his personal accounts. The corruption investigation revealed that Lyons had been using his denominational presidency to facilitate racketeering operations, grand theft, and fraud on a massive scale. He exploited his religious credibility to convince corporations they were supporting legitimate ministry work while actually funding his lavish lifestyle and criminal activities. Court proceedings exposed how Lyons had manipulated corporate executives and government officials into believing their partnerships were advancing religious and social causes, when the money was actually being diverted through complex schemes that violated federal racketeering laws. In 1999, Lyons was convicted on federal charges and sentenced to prison, destroying his reputation and sending shockwaves through the African American religious community. His fall demonstrated how easily denominational authority could be corrupted into criminal enterprise, betraying the trust of millions of faithful believers who had looked to him for spiritual leadership. Case 10. Michael Guglielmucci. Michael Guglielmucci became one of Australia's most beloved Pentecostal worship leaders, touching millions of hearts worldwide through his powerful song Healer, which topped Christian music charts and became an anthem of faith for believers facing terminal illness. His passionate worship leading and transparent vulnerability made him a trusted voice in contemporary Christian music. Guglielmucci's ministry reached new heights when he revealed his personal battle with terminal cancer, claiming doctors had given him only months to live. His congregation at Adelaide's Paradise Community Church rallied around their beloved worship pastor, praying fervently for his healing while drawing inspiration from his courage in facing death. The worship leader's cancer testimony became a powerful evangelistic tool as he shared his story at conferences and churches across Australia. Audiences wept as he described his struggle with the disease while leading worship with an oxygen tank by his side, creating deeply emotional, spiritual experiences that convinced thousands of his authentic faith. His song, Healer, took on profound meaning as believers associated it with Guglielmucci's personal cancer battle. The worship anthem became a rallying cry for Christians seeking divine healing, with its lyrics carrying special weight because they came from someone actually facing terminal illness. But in 2008, the shocking truth emerged when Guglielmucci confessed that his entire cancer diagnosis had been an elaborate fabrication designed to cover up his secret addiction to pornography. The oxygen tank that symbolized his brave fight against terminal illness was nothing more than a theatrical prop used to maintain his deceptive performance. The revelation devastated his congregation and the global Christian community, who had prayed earnestly for his healing and found inspiration in his supposed courage. His fake cancer testimony had exploited people's genuine compassion and spiritual concern for someone they believed was dying. Guglielmucci's confession revealed that he had used the fabricated illness to avoid confronting his pornography addiction, creating an elaborate lie that manipulated thousands of sincere believers while making a mockery of people who actually faced terminal diagnoses. Case 11. Robert Tilton. Robert Tilton built a televangelism empire through his Success and Life television program, reaching millions of desperate viewers with his prosperity gospel message that promised financial miracles in exchange for seed faith donations. His passionate preaching and confident declarations convinced struggling families that God would multiply their sacrificial gifts into abundant blessings. Tilton's ministry generated enormous revenue through his sophisticated direct mail campaigns and television appeals that targeted financially desperate viewers. His charismatic presentations promised that viewers' donations would trigger supernatural financial breakthroughs, with God obligated to return their gifts, multiplied according to biblical principles of sowing and reaping. The Prosperity Preacher's television broadcasts featured dramatic testimonials from supposed followers who claimed to have received miraculous financial windfalls after sending money to his ministry. These carefully crafted success stories convinced vulnerable viewers that Tilton possessed genuine spiritual authority to facilitate divine financial intervention. Tilton's organization processed millions of dollars in donations from believers who trusted that their sacrificial giving would activate God's prosperity promises. His ministry marketed prayer cloths, blessed oils, and other spiritual products that supposedly carried supernatural power to transform donors' financial circumstances. But ABC's Primetime Live investigation exposed Tilton's operation as a cynical fraud designed to exploit financially desperate people. Investigative reporters discovered thousands of prayer requests and donation letters dumped in trash bins, revealing that Tilton's organization was depositing checks while discarding the heartfelt pleas for prayer that accompanied them. The investigation revealed that Tilton's ministry had no intention of actually praying for donors or providing the spiritual services they requested. His sophisticated fundraising operation was designed purely to extract money from vulnerable people while providing nothing in return except false hope and broken promises. Former employees testified that Tilton's organization systematically targeted elderly and financially struggling viewers, using psychological manipulation and false spiritual promises to convince them to send money they couldn't afford. His prosperity gospel had become a predatory scheme that enriched himself while devastating the finances of sincere believers. Case 12, Todd Bentley. Todd Bentley ignited the Christian world in 2008 when his Floridea healing outpouring in Lakeland drew hundreds of thousands of pilgrims seeking miraculous healing and supernatural encounters. His heavily tattooed appearance and unconventional ministry style attracted young believers who found traditional Christianity stale, while his claims of angelic visitations and dramatic healings convinced followers they were witnessing a genuine spiritual awakening. The Canadian evangelist's revival meetings became international sensations as reports of miraculous healings, resurrections from the dead, and supernatural manifestations spread through Christian media. Major televangelists and respected church leaders endorsed Bentley's ministry, lending credibility to his claims of divine commissioning for end-times revival. Bentley's passionate preaching and dramatic demonstrations created an electric atmosphere where desperate people traveled from around the world seeking healing for terminal illnesses, disabilities, and chronic conditions. His ministry claimed thousands of documented miracles, including creative healings where missing body parts allegedly grew back during his prayer sessions. The revival's momentum peaked when prominent church leaders conducted a commissioning ceremony that formally endorsed Bentley as a genuine apostle appointed for global ministry. The ceremony was broadcast internationally, solidifying his credibility among charismatic Christians who viewed the endorsement as divine confirmation of his supernatural calling. But the revival collapsed spectacularly when Bentley's ministry suddenly announced his indefinite suspension due to unhealthy spiritual alliances and moral failures. Investigations revealed that he had been conducting an emotional affair while his wife was pregnant, destroying his marriage and credibility simultaneously. Further scrutiny exposed serious financial irregularities within Bentley's organization, including questionable handling of the millions of dollars donated by Revival's supporters. The man who claimed divine authority had been systematically betraying his family, while potentially misappropriating funds from sincere believers. The scandal sent shockwaves through the charismatic movement, forcing uncomfortable questions about discernment and spiritual authority. Bentley's fall demonstrated how easily revival excitement could mask serious character defects and financial impropriety that contradicted the supposed spiritual anointing he claimed to possess. Case 13. Bill Gothard. Bill Gothard commanded extraordinary influence over conservative Christian families through his Institute in Basic Life Principles, teaching millions of parents that his 7 basic life principles represented God's infallible blueprint for successful Christian living. His conferences attracted massive audiences who viewed his systematic approach to biblical principles as the ultimate guide for raising godly children and maintaining moral households. Gothard's homeschooling curriculum and family seminars reached over 2.5 million people who trusted his authoritative interpretation of biblical family structure. His teachings emphasized strict patriarchal hierarchy, modest dress codes, and complete submission to parental authority that appealed to conservative families seeking clear moral guidance in an increasingly secular culture. The influential teacher's ministry positioned him as America's foremost expert on biblical family principles, with his curriculum adopted by thousands of homeschooling families who believed his systematic approach would protect their children from worldly corruption. His conferences drew standing ovations from parents grateful for his clear, uncompromising biblical standards. Gothard's organization recruited young women to serve as volunteers and staff members in his headquarters, where his patriarchal teachings created an environment of absolute deference to his spiritual authority. These dedicated young women viewed service to his ministry as sacred calling that would advance God's kingdom through biblical family principles. But starting in 2014, over 30 women courageously came forward with allegations that Gothard had systematically exploited his spiritual authority to sexually harass and abuse young female staff members and volunteers. The accusations revealed a pattern of predatory behavior spanning decades, where Gothard used his position as moral patriarch to manipulate vulnerable young women. The allegations described how Gothard would invite young women to private counseling sessions where he would engage in inappropriate touching, sexual comments, and manipulation disguised as spiritual mentoring. His teachings about submission and authority created perfect conditions for exploitation of trusting young women who viewed questioning his behavior as spiritual rebellion. The scandal destroyed Gothard's reputation and forced his resignation from the organization he had built, revealing how patriarchal authority could become a weapon for systematic abuse of the very people it claimed to protect. Case 14. James Macdonald. James Macdonald built Harvest Bible Chapel into one of America's fastest-growing megachurch networks, while establishing himself as a prominent voice in evangelical Christianity through his Walk in the Word radio ministry that reached millions of listeners daily. His unapologetic preaching style and bold biblical proclamations attracted devoted followers who appreciated his direct, no-nonsense approach to Christian leadership. Macdonald's ministry empire expanded rapidly across multiple states, with his charismatic leadership and passionate sermons drawing thousands of members who viewed him as a fearless defender of biblical truth. His radio broadcasts and published books established him as a respected evangelical author, whose teachings influenced pastors and church leaders nationwide. The influential pastor cultivated an image of uncompromising moral authority, frequently criticizing other church leaders for compromising biblical standards while positioning himself as a model of authentic Christian leadership. His confident demeanor and authoritative preaching convinced followers that his spiritual insights represented genuine biblical wisdom. Macdonald's leadership philosophy emphasized absolute loyalty to pastoral authority, creating a church culture where questioning his decisions was viewed as spiritual rebellion against God-appointed leadership. His inner circle of elders and staff members operated under intense pressure to maintain complete support for his vision and methods. But Macdonald's carefully constructed public image collapsed when secret audio recordings surfaced, revealing his private conversations filled with profanity, crude sexual comments, and vicious personal attacks against church members and fellow pastors. The recordings captured him using language that directly contradicted his public persona as a moral authority. The explosive audio evidence revealed Macdonald's true character behind closed doors, where he routinely engaged in gossip, character assassination, and vulgar commentary that shocked even his critics. His private conversations demonstrated a pattern of abusive leadership that contradicted everything he publicly preached about Christian character. Financial investigations uncovered additional evidence of improper use of church funds for personal expenses and questionable business dealings that violated his organization's stated financial policies. Macdonald's dual life as public moral authority and private corrupt leader finally destroyed his credibility and forced his removal from leadership. Case 15. George Whitefield. George Whitefield became colonial America's first celebrity preacher during the Great Awakening of the 1740s, drawing crowds of up to 20,000 people who traveled hundreds of miles to hear his passionate outdoor sermons. His dramatic preaching style and theatrical delivery made him the most famous public figure in pre-revolutionary America, with even secular audiences attending his revivals as entertainment spectacles. Whitefield's ministry transformed American religious culture through his innovative use of publicity, advanced marketing, and newspaper promotion that created unprecedented excitement around his revival tours. His celebrity status attracted endorsements from prominent figures like Benjamin Franklin, who admired his effectiveness while questioning his methods and motivations. The charismatic evangelist's preaching tours generated enormous revenue through carefully orchestrated collection efforts that appealed to audiences' emotions and spiritual concerns. His organization operated like a modern entertainment enterprise, with merchandise sales, advanced ticket distribution, and strategic venue selection designed to maximize both attendance and financial returns. Whitefield's public persona emphasized his sacrificial dedication to spreading the gospel and advancing God's kingdom, convincing followers that his ministry represented pure spiritual motivation rather than personal ambition. His dramatic outdoor preaching and emotional appeals created powerful religious experiences that left lasting impressions on colonial audiences. But Franklin's detailed observations and contemporary critics exposed significant contradictions between Whitefield's public image and private behavior. Despite preaching against materialism and worldly wealth, Whitefield accumulated substantial personal assets while maintaining an expensive lifestyle that contradicted his teachings about spiritual priorities. Most controversially, Whitefield became a vocal defender of slavery while simultaneously owning enslaved people to work his Georgia plantation. His theological justification of human bondage directly contradicted his preaching about human dignity and God's love for all people, revealing profound moral hypocrisy at the core of his ministry. Franklin documented how Whitefield's organization employed sophisticated manipulation techniques to extract donations from emotionally vulnerable audiences, raising questions about whether his revival methods represented genuine spiritual awakening or calculated exploitation of religious sentiment for financial gain. Case 16. Carl Lentz. Carl Lentz transformed Hillsong NYC into the coolest church in America, attracting A-list celebrities like Justin Bieber, Selena Gomez, and Kevin Durant, who found his hip, non-judgmental approach to Christianity refreshingly authentic. His skinny jeans, designer sneakers, and carefully styled appearance made him the face of modern evangelical cool that appealed to young urbanites seeking spiritual meaning without traditional religious baggage. Lentz's celebrity connections and social media savvy turned his church into a cultural phenomenon that attracted massive media attention and thousands of young followers who viewed him as proof that Christianity could be relevant and trendy. His friendship with global superstars gave him unprecedented platform to influence popular culture's perception of evangelical faith. The charismatic pastor's preaching style emphasized love, acceptance, and personal transformation while avoiding controversial topics that might alienate his diverse, high-profile congregation. His approach attracted praise from secular media outlets that portrayed him as representing Christianity's progressive future beyond traditional moral conservatism. Lentz's influence extended far beyond his church through his social media presence and celebrity relationships that made him one of the most recognizable religious figures in popular culture. His lifestyle and ministry approach inspired countless young pastors who sought to replicate his success in attracting culturally relevant congregations. But in November 2020, Hillsong's leadership fired Lentz after discovering his extramarital affair and pattern of leadership failures that had compromised his moral authority. The dismissal revealed that his celebrity lifestyle had enabled personal behavior that directly contradicted his public image as a spiritual leader. Investigation into Lentz's conduct exposed a pattern of inappropriate relationships with women, financial irregularities, and narcissistic leadership that had created toxic dynamics within his church staff. His obsession with celebrity culture had corrupted his spiritual priorities and enabled systematic misconduct disguised as ministry innovation. The scandal shattered the image of hip, progressive Christianity that Lentz had cultivated, revealing how celebrity obsession could corrupt authentic spiritual leadership. His fall demonstrated that cultural relevance without moral accountability ultimately destroys the credibility that makes ministry effective. Case 17. Ted Haggard. Ted Haggard wielded extraordinary political influence as senior pastor of New Life Church in Colorado Springs and president of the National Association of Evangelicals, representing 30 million conservative Christians who viewed him as their primary voice in American politics. His weekly phone calls with the White House and regular appearances on national television made him one of the most powerful religious figures in George Bush's administration. Haggard's 14,000-member megachurch and national leadership position gave him unprecedented access to political leaders who sought his endorsement and guidance on moral issues affecting evangelical voters. His passionate advocacy for traditional marriage and conservative family values made him a hero to religious conservatives who trusted his moral authority on cultural battlegrounds. The influential pastor's political activism extended beyond his pulpit through his leadership of initiatives opposing same-sex marriage and promoting conservative Christian values in public policy. His organization mobilized millions of evangelical voters who viewed him as their champion in defending biblical morality against secular liberal attacks. Haggard's public image as a devoted family man and moral leader made him the perfect spokesman for evangelical political causes, with his telegenic appearance and articulate communication skills making him a favorite guest on news programs discussing religious perspectives on controversial issues. But in November 2006, male escort Mike Jones publicly revealed his 3-year sexual relationship with Haggard, providing detailed evidence including voicemail recordings and testimony about their regular encounters. Jones also alleged that Haggard had purchased and used methamphetamine during their meetings, contradicting his public stance against drug use. The scandal exploded into national headlines when Haggard initially denied the allegations before admitting to sexual immorality and resigning from all leadership positions. His confession revealed that his entire political career had been sustained while maintaining a secret homosexual relationship that directly contradicted his public opposition to same-sex relationships. The revelations destroyed Haggard's credibility and sent shockwaves through the evangelical political movement, exposing the hypocrisy of using moral authority to influence public policy while privately engaging in the behaviors he publicly condemned. Case 18. Ravi Zacharias. Ravi Zacharias commanded unparalleled respect as Christianity's foremost intellectual defender, using his brilliant mind and sophisticated theological arguments to engage skeptics at prestigious universities worldwide. His Ravi Zacharias International Ministries reached millions of educated seekers who found his reasoned approach to faith compelling, evidence for Christianity's intellectual credibility in an increasingly secular academic environment. Zacharias's apologetics ministry established him as the definitive Christian voice capable of engaging hostile intellectual audiences with grace, wisdom, and scholarly rigor that even critics admired. His books, lectures, and debates with prominent atheists demonstrated Christianity's intellectual sophistication while attracting countless converts through rational arguments rather than emotional manipulation. The renowned apologist's global influence extended through his training of young Christian intellectuals who viewed him as their mentor and model for engaging secular culture. His organization developed curricula and programs that equipped thousands of Christian leaders with tools for defending their faith in academic and professional environments. Zacharias's impeccable reputation and moral authority made him a trusted advisor to world leaders, prominent pastors, and influential Christian organizations who sought his wisdom on complex theological and ethical issues. His scholarly demeanor and apparent humility convinced even skeptics that he represented Christianity's best intellectual traditions. But after Zacharias's death in May 2020, an independent investigation commissioned by his own ministry uncovered shocking evidence of systematic sexual misconduct spanning decades. The investigation revealed that he had exploited his ministry travels to engage in predatory behavior with vulnerable women seeking spiritual guidance. The devastating report documented how Zacharias had used his intellectual authority to manipulate women into sexual encounters at spas he owned, where he convinced victims that their submission to his advances represented spiritual service. His scholarly reputation had provided perfect cover for systematic abuse disguised as ministry. Most tragically, The investigation revealed that Zacharias had threatened suicide to silence victims who attempted to expose his behavior, using emotional manipulation to protect his reputation, while continuing to abuse vulnerable women who trusted his spiritual authority. The revelations destroyed his legacy and forced the dissolution of his global ministry organization. Case 19. Jimmy Swaggart. Jimmy Swaggart built the largest Pentecostal television ministry in the world during the 1980s, reaching over 500 million viewers globally through his passionate preaching and powerful musical performances that convinced millions they were witnessing authentic spiritual anointing. His Assemblies of God credentials and fiery sermons against moral compromise made him the undisputed leader of America's televangelism movement. Swaggart's ministry generated over $150 million annually through his television broadcasts, crusades, and Bible college that trained thousands of ministers who carried his theological influence worldwide. His emotional preaching style and apparent sincere devotion attracted devoted followers who viewed him as God's chosen vessel for end-times revival. The influential evangelist positioned himself as Christianity's moral watchdog, publicly condemning fellow televangelists like Jim Bakker for financial scandals, while presenting his own ministry as a model of integrity and spiritual authenticity. His righteous indignation against corruption made him a hero to conservative Christians seeking pure spiritual leadership. Swaggart's crusades against pornography, sexual immorality, and worldly compromise created an image of uncompromising moral authority that resonated with audiences seeking clear biblical standards. His tearful altar calls and passionate denunciations of sin convinced followers that his ministry represented genuine holiness in an increasingly corrupt world. But in February 1988, rival minister Marvin Gorman exposed Swaggart's secret relationship with prostitute Deborah Murphy, providing photographic evidence that destroyed his carefully constructed moral image. The revelation came after Swaggart had orchestrated Gorman's downfall, making his own exposure an act of calculated revenge. Swaggart's tearful "I have sinned" confession before his congregation became an iconic moment of televangelism hypocrisy, but his refusal to submit to denominational discipline led to his defrocking from the Assemblies of God. His defiant continuation of ministry despite official censure revealed his prioritization of personal empire over genuine repentance. The scandal deepened when Swaggart was caught with another prostitute in 1991, proving that his public confession had been meaningless theater rather than authentic transformation, finally destroying his credibility as a moral authority. Case 20. Jim and Tammy Faye Bakker. Jim and Tammy Faye Bakker became the first couple of televangelism through their PTL Club television program, building a media empire that reached millions of viewers who saw them as the perfect Christian family representing prosperity gospel success. Their Heritage USA theme park in South Carolina attracted 6 million visitors annually, making it America's third most popular destination behind Disney World and Disneyland. The Bakkers' lavish lifestyle and emotional television presentations convinced followers that God rewarded faithful Christians with material abundance and spiritual joy. Tammy Faye's tearful makeup and Jim's confident promises created a compelling narrative that prosperity and righteousness went hand in hand for truly committed believers. Their PTL ministry generated over $129 million annually through viewer donations, lifetime partnerships, and merchandise sales that funded their expanding media and real estate empire. The couple's visible wealth and happiness seemed to validate their teaching that faithful Christians should expect divine blessing in every area of life. Jim Bakker's charismatic leadership and business acumen transformed televangelism into sophisticated entertainment that combined religious programming with theme park attractions, luxury accommodations, and celebrity guest appearances. Their operation represented the pinnacle of 1980s religious entrepreneurship that inspired countless imitators. But their empire collapsed when Jessica Hahn revealed her sexual encounter with Jim Bakker and the subsequent hush money payment designed to silence her allegations. The scandal exposed systematic financial fraud, where the Bakkers had oversold lifetime partnerships while using donor funds to support their extravagant personal lifestyle. Federal investigation revealed that Jim Bakker had defrauded followers of $158 million through fraudulent fundraising schemes that promised services and accommodations that never existed. His ministry had become an elaborate Ponzi scheme that exploited sincere religious devotion for personal enrichment. Bakker's 1989 conviction on 24 federal fraud charges and 45-year prison sentence destroyed the PTL empire and ended an era of televangelism excess. His fall became the defining symbol of religious greed and corruption that permanently damaged public trust in prosperity gospel ministries. 20 American preachers who convinced millions they possessed divine authority, only to be exposed as frauds, predators, and criminals, whose true nature shocked even their most devoted followers. Each story follows the same devastating trajectory. Charismatic leaders who claimed special anointing from God, accumulated devoted followers who surrendered their critical thinking, built powerful organizations that generated enormous wealth and influence, then exploited their spiritual authority to commit increasingly heinous crimes against the very people who trusted them most. The pattern raises uncomfortable questions about how easily spiritual authority can become a mask for evil and whether religious communities possess adequate safeguards to prevent such systematic abuse by charismatic leaders who claim divine mandate for their actions. What do you think enables these religious predators to maintain their deception for so long? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more shocking investigations into corruption and betrayal by those who claimed moral authority over innocent lives.